I was sitting on the porch of my ranch, the same spot I've sat on for years, sipping my coffee and looking out over the wide, open fields. There was no rush here, no deadlines, no bosses. Just me and my land, a few animals, and the peace that came with having worked hard to create this little piece of freedom. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No one had a claim on it. Or at least, that's what I thought. That was until the HOA got involved. I first noticed something was off when a sign appeared out by the fence. It was one of those cheap plastic ones that looked like it had been slapped together in a hurry. It said something about property under review, and I couldn't make heads or tails of it. HOA compliance? I hadn't even heard of any HOA in this part of the country. I stood there for a while, staring at the sign like it might suddenly explain itself. Of course it didn't. So, I ripped it down, tossed it in the fire pit, and went back to my coffee. Problem solved. Or so I thought. The next day, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find a woman standing there, dressed in pastel pink and khaki pants, clipboard in hand. Her smile was all business, like she had all the authority in the world. "Hi, I'm Karen Simmons, president of the Simmons Valley Homeowners Association." She chirped, like we were about to exchange pleasantries instead of having a confrontation. I raised an eyebrow, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Help you with something?" She looked around, eyes scanning my property like she was inspecting it. "We're just here to ensure everything's up to code. Visual standards, fencing heights, that sort of thing." I let out a short laugh. "Lady, this is farmland, not a country club. There's nothing visual about it except for cows and tractors." She didn't flinch. "We're currently in an awareness phase, but citations will begin soon. Just a friendly reminder." She handed me a packet of papers labeled, "Welcome Packet. Action Required." I stared at the packet for a moment. It was a joke. A bad one. Regulations for how high my fence should be. A visual corridor for my satellite dish. Ridiculous. I didn't even bother reading it all the way through before I tossed it into the fire pit. But Karen wasn't done. 2 days later, I came out to find larger, laminated signs posted all over my property. Under enforcement review, they said, with red circles around my fence and satellite dish. This time, they weren't just stapling things to my barn. They'd gone as far as using nails. I tore those down too, feeling the rage build up inside me. That's when things really started to get weird. The next day, 2 men showed up. They were dressed in khakis, matching vests that said HOA Patrol, and were carrying clipboards like they were preparing to conduct a military operation. They started walking around my property like they were looking for something, pointing at random objects like my tractor and mumbling into their radios. I stepped outside, hands on my hips, and asked, "What are you guys doing?" One of them froze like I'd caught him red-handed. He cleared his throat. "We're conducting a compliance sweep," he said, sounding like he had rehearsed it 100 times. I stared at them for a moment, trying to figure out what was going on. "You got badges? Permission to be here?" They looked at each other, unsure. We operate under the Simmons Valley Charter." "Right. Well, you're trespassing under Callahan property law." I shot back. "Get off my land." They didn't argue. They just turned around and started walking off, but not before one of them dropped his clipboard. I picked it up, and to my shock, inside were maps of my property, marked with red X's like they were planning something. My place was marked as Alpha, high resistance. That's when I knew this wasn't just some weird HOA issue. This was bigger. I made a call to the sheriff's deputy in town. "You ever heard of this HOA?" I asked him. He paused. "Nope, but I know Karen Simmons. She tried to report a noise disturbance last year. Some feed store in town was making too much noise. She's a bit of a control freak." The dots started to connect. This wasn't just about fences or a satellite dish. Karen had something bigger in mind, and that meant I had to be prepared. I started setting up some defenses. Nothing lethal, just enough to make sure I knew if they were coming back. Motion sensors, trail cameras, remote lights. If they wanted to keep pushing, they were going to have to work for it. It didn't take long before they did. They came before dawn, in total silence, but I was already waiting. I heard the crunch of gravel on my driveway. Too light to be a truck, too coordinated to be a deer. I could tell the moment they crossed the line into my property. They thought they were being sneaky. They were wrong. I didn't panic. I grabbed my boots, and filled up my coffee mug with the remnants of yesterday's brew. I had been through worse than this. I stepped out onto the porch, knowing they were out there, just waiting for the right moment. And when that moment came, I was ready. It wasn't just the usual trespassers anymore. This time, they had come prepared. The quietness of the morning hung in the air, broken only by the crunch of boots on the gravel. I could feel the tension building in the pit of my stomach, a familiar feeling from my past experiences. The wind was still, and the usual chorus of birds and animals hadn't started up yet. The silence seemed too perfect, too calculated. I didn't need to see them to know they were there. This was their second attempt, and I knew exactly how they'd play it. I had my eyes trained on the driveway, watching the shadows move under the faint light of the pre-dawn sky. They were being careful, too careful, which told me everything I needed to know. There were more of them this time, at least 5, maybe 6, moving stealthily across the land. I could see the faint outline of their figures, black vests and khakis blending into the dark landscape. They had headlamps now, mounted on their foreheads, their hands clutching clipboards like they were holding the keys to some grand conspiracy. They looked like they were on a mission, an official one, or so they thought. I stayed where I was, watching from the porch, my heart rate steady, my body still. They were close, just beyond the edge of the barn now, moving with the kind of quiet purpose that could only be learned through practice. But they hadn't seen me yet, hadn't realized I was fully aware of their every move. The first few seconds of their intrusion were met with absolute stillness on my part, but inside, I was calculating. I'd set the motion sensors up around the perimeter, and the first one had triggered already. A soft click, almost undetectable, but enough to alert me that they were on my property. They weren't sneaking in for a quick raid. They were prepared. As they spread out across the field, I could see their bodies tense up, their focus sharp. They were expecting trouble. What they didn't know was that I was expecting them. The trap was set, and they were walking right into it. I took a slow sip from my coffee mug, the steam rising in the chilly air. I could feel the familiar hum of tension in my muscles. It had been a while since I felt like this, but the instinct was still there, buried deep within. This wasn't a random group of trespassers. These were professionals. They weren't here for a minor dispute about fencing. They were here with a purpose. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. I moved to the side window, crouching low to get a better view of their movements. They were spreading out now, taking positions like they were planning to surround me, but I already knew where each of them was. The area around the barn had become their focal point, but what they didn't see was the series of traps I had in place. The first one was about to spring. They hadn't even noticed the motion sensors under the dirt, buried just enough to be overlooked. As soon as they crossed that invisible line, they would trigger the floodlights. I watched them for a moment longer, taking in their movements. Their radios crackled quietly, but I could tell by the way they moved that they were on a coordinated mission. They thought they were in control, but I could see the slight tension in their bodies, the nerves they try to hide. One of them, clipboard in hand, was walking too close to the east fence where Linda, my goat, was sleeping peacefully. I had a special spot for her there. She wasn't just a pet. She was part of my defense system now, the last line of defense if anything went sideways. I smiled to myself, knowing she'd be the one to greet them first if they got too close. And then it happened. One of them tripped the wire. It was a simple setup, nothing fancy, but it was enough to make a loud, sharp click that echoed across the field. At that moment, everything changed. The floodlights that I had set up along the property line shot on with blinding intensity. The siren screamed, loud and piercing, filling the air with noise. It wasn't a violent explosion of sound, but it was enough to disorient them, enough to make them panic. The barn, which had been dark just moments ago, lit up like a stadium on game day. The floodlights lit up the entire area, and the sound of sirens was so sharp it rattled their nerves. I could hear the startled shouts as they dove for cover. 2 of them dropped immediately, hitting the ground in surprise. Another guy ran headfirst into the water trough, his face splashing into the dirty water as he tried to shield himself. Another stumbled backward into Linda's enclosure, and I could hear her ram him in the thigh. That was the moment I knew everything was going according to plan. Linda wasn't just a goat. She was a guard dog in disguise. I could hear the confused cries as they tried to get their bearings, scrambling to find cover. I stepped out onto the porch, deliberately slow, taking another sip of my coffee. The chaos was unfolding before me, but I wasn't in a hurry. There was no need to rush. These were amateurs playing at being enforcers. They didn't realize that I had set everything up for them. They were walking straight into the trap, and now there was no way out. One of them looked up and saw me standing on the porch, calm as could be, coffee in hand. I didn't shout. I didn't make any threats. I just watched them with a quiet satisfaction. I had one more trap left to trigger, but I was enjoying this too much to rush it. The guy with the clipboard stood up, dusting himself off. He wiped the dirt from his pants and looked back at the others, his face pale. They weren't ready for what was coming next. Neither were they ready for me. The game had changed, and now they were the ones caught in the crosshairs. I was no longer the one on the defensive. They were. They tried to get up and move, but every time they moved, the motion sensors picked them up. The sound of the sirens only grew louder, filling their heads with the panic that comes from realizing you're outmatched. The shadows were moving too fast, too coordinated. They were stuck, and there was nowhere to hide. It wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about my land. This was a battle between freedom and control, between those who wanted to make their own rules and those who thought they had the right to impose theirs. And in this battle, I was going to make sure they knew exactly who they were up against. The next time they tried to cross the line, they weren't going to be able to walk away from it. The sirens continued to wail, their shrill sound reverberating across the open fields, but I didn't flinch. The men scrambling in the dirt, trying to make sense of the chaos I'd set in motion, were completely out of their element. The confusion on their faces was unmistakable, and they hadn't yet realized the depth of the trap they had walked into. The floodlights illuminated every corner of my property, casting long shadows and turning the barn into a glaring beacon in the night. But still, they struggled to regroup, their movements disjointed and panicked. I could see the panic creeping in as they tried to make sense of their situation. The man who had fallen into the trough was still sputtering, trying to get his bearings, while the others were crouching behind fences, huddling in places that no longer offered them the cover they once thought they had. I could feel the tension building, but I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing me rattle. My hand tightened around my coffee mug as I waited for the perfect moment. But it wasn't just the floodlights and sirens that had thrown them off. It was the knowing. I could tell by the way they kept looking over their shoulders that they were wondering what was next. I wasn't going to give them the chance to regroup or figure it out. They had come here thinking they had the upper hand, but I had been preparing for this moment for far too long to let them take it from me. I could hear the sound of their voices rising in frustration as they tried to regain control, but it was clear they were losing their grip. One of them stumbled over his own feet, trying to reach for his walkie-talkie, but the signal was lost, drowned out by the sound of the sirens and the overwhelming brightness of the floodlights. I wasn't sure what they had expected when they came here, but it wasn't this. They thought they were just dealing with a man and his property. They didn't realize they were stepping into something bigger, something that had been meticulously planned out, layer by layer. I waited for them to make their next move, but instead of charging forward like I thought they would, they hesitated. They were caught in the open, exposed under the harsh lights. No longer the predator, they had become the prey. I could see the moment they realized it. One by one, they started backing off, moving slowly, unsure of what would happen next. Their plan was crumbling, and they didn't know how to salvage it. I watched them, letting the silence stretch between us, until the sound of tires on gravel broke it. The sirens still wailed, but the arrival of another vehicle, the unmistakable sound of a sheriff's cruiser, was a game changer. My eyes flicked to the edge of the field where the car had appeared, its red and blue lights flashing, cutting through the chaos like a signal of law and order. I didn't need to see the officer to know it was Langston, the sheriff's deputy I had called earlier. He was the one person I knew could cut through the noise and put an end to this. The men in khaki and vests froze, their eyes wide as they saw the sheriff's car coming closer. They knew that their charade was about to end. The man with the clipboard, The one who had been in charge of this whole mess turned sharply, his face drained of color. He was trying to figure out his next move, but it was too late. Langston was already stepping out of the cruiser, his boots crunching on the gravel as he surveyed the scene. There was no rush in his movements, no urgency. He was calm, calculated, as if he'd dealt with situations like this before. He was here to take charge, and everyone knew it. The fake HOA enforcers were still trying to make sense of their failed operation. Some were trying to stand up, dusting themselves off, while others were still crouched in awkward positions, trying to hide behind anything that could shield them from Langston's approach. But they knew they couldn't outrun him. They couldn't outmaneuver a real lawman, and they couldn't escape the mess they had made. Langston took in the scene in an instant. His eyes flicked from men to the floodlights, to the sirens, and finally to me. There was no question in his mind who was in the right here. The fake enforcers, despite their official-looking vests and clipboards, were nothing more than actors playing a role. Their badges, their paperwork, it all screamed of inauthenticity. He wasn't fooled for a second. He turned to the men, his voice low but firm. "Hands where I can see them," he commanded, his presence commanding authority without raising his voice. The men hesitated, unsure of what to do next, but Langston didn't wait. He stepped forward, grabbing the man with the clipboard and pulling the badge right off his vest. The badge crumpled in his hand, as if it were made of paper, a worthless piece of plastic and cloth that had no real meaning in this world. One by one, the fake enforcers dropped their clipboards and raised their hands in surrender. The show was over. Langston had seen enough. The law had finally arrived, and the fake HOA enforcers were out of options. They were trapped, their plans unraveling faster than they could react. The only thing they could do now was follow Langston's orders, and they did, all of them. As Langston cuffed the first one, his expression was unreadable, but I could see the weight of the situation settling in. The fake enforcers were just pawns in a larger game, and they had been played. Langston looked back at me. "You're not dealing with a simple HOA here," he said quietly, as if he had come to the same conclusion I had. The situation was bigger than just a property dispute. There were forces at work here, and they weren't going to stop with a few fake cops. But I had no intention of letting them get away with it. Not now. Not ever. The tension hung heavy in the air as Langston cuffed the last of the would-be enforcers. He didn't speak much, but the silence between us spoke volumes. The floodlights were still blinding, the sirens still howling in the background, but there was a shift in the atmosphere. The fake enforcers, once so sure of themselves, were now just criminals caught in the act. They hadn't expected any of this. They hadn't expected me to fight back, and they certainly hadn't expected real law enforcement to show up uninvited and unprepared. As Langston finished processing the men, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. This wasn't just some rogue HOA enforcement team. This was part of something bigger. The way they operated, the way they had come at me with such coordination and false authority, it felt like they were part of a well-oiled machine, one that had a larger purpose. But what that purpose was, I couldn't yet see. The sheriff deputy took a moment to speak with the men, but they weren't giving up much. Their faces were all the same, nervous, angry, and afraid. It was clear they hadn't anticipated being caught in the act. They had assumed that their fake badges and documents would be enough to intimidate someone like me, someone who had been left alone for so long. But I wasn't going to let them intimidate me. This wasn't just about property lines or regulations anymore. This was about something more sinister. While Langston handled the enforcers, I walked over to my barn, my mind racing. The pictures I had taken, the maps I had found, those were the clues that told a much darker story. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to come after me, and they weren't going to stop just because a few fake enforcers were arrested. I didn't know who was behind this, but I knew they were willing to push as far as necessary to get what they wanted. It wasn't just about my land. It was about something bigger. I stepped into the barn and walked over to the corner where I had hidden my equipment. The cameras, the motion sensors, the floodlights, everything was set up for a reason. I had prepared for an attack like this, but what I hadn't prepared for was the fact that this was just the beginning. I had no idea who Karen was working with, but I knew she wasn't acting alone. The maps, the targeted surveillance, the detailed plans, they all pointed to something larger. I wasn't just dealing with a single HOA president with a vendetta. I was dealing with a network, a system designed to intimidate, control, and manipulate. And they were willing to use any means necessary to do so. I couldn't stay here, not without knowing what else they were planning. I had to figure out what this was all about before they came back. And they would come back. I had no doubt about that. The situation had escalated too far for them to back down now. They'd seen my resistance, and that meant I was a target. I wasn't just a landowner who refused to comply with regulations. I had become part of a bigger game, a game I hadn't asked to play, but was now deeply entangled in. As I stepped back outside, I noticed Langston was finishing up with the last of the fake enforcers. They were being loaded into the back of the squad car, their heads hung low in defeat. The deputy walked over to me, his expression still unreadable. He wasn't just dealing with a few rogue enforcers. He knew, just like I did, that this wasn't over. He glanced back at the squad car, where the men were being driven away. "This isn't the end, is it?" he asked, more a statement than a question. I nodded slowly. It wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The truth was out there, hidden in plain sight. The enforcers had been just one piece of the puzzle. But who was pulling the strings? I felt my pulse quicken as I realized that my next move was critical. I had to find out who was behind this. I had to understand why they were targeting me and what they had planned next. They had made a mistake coming here, thinking I'd be an easy target. But now I wasn't going to rest until I had answers. As Langston left, he gave me one last look. "Stay safe, Callahan. You've got a lot more to figure out." I didn't reply. Instead, I turned back toward the house, my mind working in overdrive. There was no time to waste. They would be back, and I needed to be ready. But this time, I would be the one making the moves. I wasn't going to wait for them to come for me again. I was going to go after them first. Later that night, after the adrenaline had faded and the house was quiet, I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of documents the fake enforcers had left behind. I flipped through the papers, looking for anything that could give me a clue as to who was really behind this operation. And then I found it. A name that I recognized. It was a name from my past, someone I thought I had left behind long ago. But there it was, clear as day, connected to the fake HOA operation. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about land. It was about control, manipulation, and power. And the person behind it all had been watching me for a long time. The pieces were finally falling into place, and I knew that the real battle was just beginning.